Hey guys, tonight we begin with the Roman Empire, where economics, power, and people were mixed into a system so casually brutal, it makes modern HR departments look saintly. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. If you ever felt overwhelmed by modern job hunting, just be thankful you weren't up for literal sale at the Roman slave market. Because back in ancient Rome, your resume wasn't printed on paper. It was hung around your neck like a price tag. And yes, your defects were listed too. Bites when angry. Won't stop quoting Homer. Thinks he's above dishwashing. All fair game. The Roman slave market was, to put it delicately, a chaotic meat parade. The most famous one was in the Forum in Rome, but other cities like Delos and Ephesus had their own human bazaars. These weren't exactly dignified spaces. Picture open plazas crammed with chained people standing on display blocks, while toga-wearing men kicked their calves and poked their gums to check for tune value. Prices were scrawled on placards or shouted by auctioneers, like some depressing version of QVC. Lot number 47, able-bodied, not too sarcastic, can recite Virgil backward. Bidding wars sometimes erupted for the most sought-after slaves, doctors, scribes, or attractive concubines. That's right, you could be purchased for your brain, your biceps, or your bone structure. The Romans were efficient like that. The marketplace itself operated much like a used car dealership, except the merchandise had opinions and feelings. Slaves were often greased up, made to look younger, or even dyed to hide grey hair, ancient Rome's version of Instagram filters. And if the buyer felt duped, tough luck. Unless the seller had failed to disclose that their new purchase tended to run away, set fires, or practice amateur assassination attempts. There were also some rules. By law, sellers had to declare certain faults in a slave, like epilepsy, chronic laziness, or political opinions. But loopholes abounded. After all, if you described your rebellious Gallic prisoner as spirited and independent, you could still sleep at night. Let's say you were a regular Roman plebeian. Not a senator, not a general. Just a dude with a villa slightly nicer than your cousin's. You wanted someone to sweep the atrium, carry your scrolls, or maybe glare menacingly at your neighbor's dog. Congratulations. You were in the market for an unskilled male slave, the minimum wage worker of the ancient world, minus the wage and the rights. The going rate for this basic model human? Around 1,500 to 2,000 sesterces. That might sound like ancient monopoly money, so let's put it into perspective. A Roman legionary, the standard soldier, earned about 900 sesterces a year. So buying a human would cost you 2 years of hard military service. Or if you preferred, you could skip getting stabbed by ghouls and just inherit a rich uncle. Now, the lower-end slaves weren't always in the best condition. Some were fresh from war, malnourished, or just plain unmotivated. The ancient Roman equivalent of hiring someone who responds to any job openings with, "What's the pay again?" Still, they were cheaper than hiring a free citizen, and unlike a citizen, you could whip them for being late. Efficiency. These labourers typically worked in agriculture, construction, and mines. The mines were basically the express lane to death. If you ended up there, your life expectancy came with a countdown. But if you were lucky enough to be bought by a moderately kind baker, your days might just involve flour, shouting, and chronic back pain. There were also rental options. If you didn't have the coin to buy outright, you could lease a slave by the day, like a grim Uber service. I'll need 1 brawny Thracian, full day, no chit-chat. It's amazing what the Romans normalized before HR departments were invented. Interestingly, even unskilled slaves could increase in value with training. If your grain hauler learned to mix concrete or read receipts, congrats. He just appreciated like real estate. Some owners invested in their slaves' skills, others did not. Let's just say not every Roman cared for upward mobility, especially if it involved someone else's. So you've browsed past the basic labourer section of the Roman slave market. You're feeling fancy. Maybe you want someone who doesn't just carry bricks, but can also compose epic poetry, mix a mean mulled wine, or whisper sweet philosophy into your ear while you bathe. Congratulations. You've entered the luxury goods section of human trafficking. Talented slaves were the Roman elite's version of a smart investment. These weren't just workers. They were status symbols with vocal cords. Educated Greeks were particularly prized. Philosophers, teachers, musicians, physicians, and that rare unicorn, a slave who could do taxes and play the lyre. The price? Anywhere from 10,000 to 100,000 sesterces, depending on just how much smarter than you they were. Let's be honest, some Romans just wanted a slave who could read bedtime Ovid and flatter their ego. Others? They wanted a dentist/botanist who could fix cavities and arrange the floral centerpiece. And yes, those kinds of polymaths existed, usually imported from Alexandria or Athens, and sold like philosophical Swiss Army knives. The cruel irony was that the more gifted the slave, the more they were objectified. Oh, this one? He speaks 3 languages and paints frescoes. Bought him on sale. And unlike modern employees, talented slaves couldn't ask for a raise. They could only hope for manumission, which was like quitting your job by being legally declared a person. Female slaves with talents were also in high demand, especially if they could sing, dance, and entertain guests. Of course, entertainment in Rome could mean anything from harp recitals to highly inappropriate dinner party performances. Some were so talented, they were treated like celebrities. If celebrities had ankle chains and no dental plan, talented slaves were rarely left in the fields or mines. No, they were for the domus, the villa, the private salon where they could impress visitors and make their masters look cultured. Owning one was like saying, "Yes, I conquered Gaul, and also, here's my slave who plays the pan flute in Dorian mode." In the Roman slave market, beauty wasn't just skin deep, it was expensive. And if you had the misfortune of being both conventionally attractive and enslaved, well, congratulations. You were now worth more than a small farm. Let's be clear, Romans had tastes. Youthful, smooth-skinned, symmetrical-faced tastes. If your nose didn't deviate, and your teeth didn't resemble a crumbling aqueduct, you might just fetch 30,000 to 100,000 sesterces. Sometimes more if you could smile on command. That's not a typo. That's the price of an estate with working olive trees and a view of the Tiber. Attractive slaves were used for, shall we say, delicate domestic functions. Attendants, cupbearers, personal companions, the sort of roles where the phrase "don't drop the wine" had many layers. Their beauty wasn't just for their owner's enjoyment, it was a flex. Having a gorgeous slave serving your guests was the Roman equivalent of driving a red Ferrari through a narrow alley and not caring who you scratched. And while men weren't excluded from the pretty premium, it was young women, especially those from exotic regions, who bore the brunt of this demand. Egyptian, Syrian, Gallic, Thracian, each came with its own beauty stereotype, which Roman buyers ate up like imported oysters. And if she could also sing, recite Catullus, cry without smudging her eyeliner, bonus points. Naturally, this market had its sleazy underbelly. Special skills were often hinted at with euphemisms, and young girls and boys were sometimes sold far younger than should be legally, or ethically, tolerated by anything that isn't a demon in human form. But remember, Roman law was less about protection and more about covering the seller's rear in case of complaints. So as long as they slapped a label on the slave that said "used product" or "occasional biting," they were golden. Cosmetics, scented oils, and wardrobe enhancements were often used to boost market value, because nothing says, "I deserve a higher price," like a strategically placed perfume dab and a flattering tunic. Think of it as ancient Rome's version of a filtered selfie, just with a little more slavery. In short, beauty sold. Literally. And if you were stunning, chances are you'd end up being someone's centerpiece. Or worse, their conversational starter. Now, If there was one class of slaves who knew how to sell tickets and bleed dramatically, it was the gladiators. These weren't just men with swords. They were walking biceps with a marketing team, minus the PR agency and personal choice. And yes, their six-packs cost more than some Roman homes. Gladiators were a financial gamble wrapped in leather straps and bravado. A good one could cost 100,000 sesterces or more, depending on fame, physique, and likelihood of surviving a Tuesday. Some were prisoners of war, others were born into slavery, and a few were free citizens desperate enough to trade freedom for fan mail and potential disembowelment. Owners, known as lanistae, bought these muscle machines at premium rates, trained them in private schools, gladiator academies, not Hogwarts, and then rented them out to games for a fat appearance fee. Think of it as the UFC if fighters were considered kitchen appliances with abs. Now, not all gladiators were created equal. Some were just there to die quietly for crowd entertainment. Others, like the Mumio, the Thraex, or the sexy, oiled-up Retiarius, were meant to sell out the amphitheatre, inspire pottery fan art, and make bored Roman matrons gasp into their wine goblets. Some even had groupies, yes, actual ancient groupies, who'd etch their names on walls. Crixus makes me blush was probably a thing, and we haven't even gotten to the fan fiction on wax tablets. Of course, gladiators came with extra risk. If your investment caught a sword to the spleen, well, there went your retirement fund. Some wealthy Romans got around this by purchasing multiple fighters and branding them like cattle. After all, what says ownership better than carving your name onto a man's thigh? And just to be clear, some of these warriors weren't men. There were also gladiatrices, female gladiators, rare, theatrical, and even more expensive due to novelty value. It's one thing to win a fight. It's another to do it while the entire Senate awkwardly shifts in their togas. Ah yes, children. In most cultures, they're considered precious, innocent, the future of society. In ancient Rome, they were a budget option. If you couldn't afford a gladiator or a talented Greek tutor, you could always pick up a child for the price of a decent dinner party. A child slave could cost as little as 500 to 2,000 sesterces, depending on age, health, and whether they looked like they might survive the week. Why so cheap? Simple. Low overhead, high risk. Kids were tiny, required training, and were about as durable as a clay jug in a chariot crash. They couldn't lift heavy loads or recite Homer yet, but they could run errands, sweep floors, or fan you while you judged senators from your recliner. Some buyers liked the idea of raising their own custom slave. A little training here, a little discipline there, and voila, you had yourself a loyal servant or a slightly traumatized accountant by age 12. It was sort of like adopting a pet, if the pet could eventually quote Cicero and refill your wine. Children born to slaves, called vernae, were especially common and often raised within the household. These were house-brand slaves, bred and born into servitude, no import taxes required. Roman aristocrats could keep dozens of these little helpers scurrying around like well-dressed rats with obedience issues. Of course, Rome being Rome, some children weren't bought for labour at all. Wealthy creeps with too much coin, and no morality sometimes purchased children for entertainment. And yes, it's every bit as grim as it sounds. Let's not dwell, but suffice it to say, Roman law didn't exactly lead the way in child protection. On the less horrifying end of things, children were also given as toys to noble children. Imagine being bought so a spoiled 7-year-old named Lucius could dress you up like a doll, rename you Banana, and then forget about you the moment a new puppy arrived. In peacetime, Rome liked to pretend it was a refined society, poetry, plumbing, philosophy. But in wartime, Rome turned into one massive discount warehouse of human misery. Because when the legions marched and the borders bled, slave prices plummeted like a drunk senator off the Palatine Hill. Wars were Rome's favourite way of sourcing fresh bodies. Every conquest came with 2 trophies, land and people. And while land was valuable, people were profitable. After major conflicts, like the sack of Carthage or the defeat of the Gauls, slave markets flooded with captives, The result? Price crash. Captured en masse, these new slaves were sold in bulk, sometimes for a handful of sesterces and a decent promise not to riot. Imagine walking into a market and hearing, "Today only. Buy 3 Gauls. Get a Dacian free." That's not far from reality. During the Mithridatic Wars, there were so many slaves available that sellers reportedly couldn't even find buyers. Roman economists, aka guys yelling in togas, wrung their hands about the devaluation. But hey, business was booming. If you were middle class and had been saving up, now was the time to buy that household staff you always wanted. But of course, low price didn't always mean low cost. Many of these wartime slaves were traumatized, rebellious, and knew how to fight, which is a bit of a problem when you're trying to teach them how to fold napkins and clean mosaics. Some revolts, like Spartacus's infamous uprising, were fueled by just such folks. Battle-tested, emotionally unavailable, now sharpening a kitchen knife. Still, the savings were undeniable. Plantation owners, called latifundia owners, swooped in like vultures at a toga outlet. They bought hundreds of these captives at fire sale prices and worked them to death in the mines or the fields. Quantity over quality was the motto. Think of it as the ancient Roman version of fast fashion. Cheap, replaceable, and morally uncomfortable. Even Julius Caesar once sold thousands of Gallic prisoners in a single afternoon, flooding the market so fast that prices briefly dipped below the cost of a decent tunic. For Rome, war wasn't just glory, it was clearance season. If you thought Roman slave prices were just based on vibes, think again. Like a grim version of eBay mixed with a cattle auction, the price of a slave in ancient Rome could vary wildly, depending on a long list of features, upgrades, and optional trauma. Let's start with the big 5 variables: age, health, appearance, skills, and origin. First, age. Youth was ideal, but not too young. No one wanted a teething liability or a stooped ancient who wheezed at the sight of stairs. Slaves in their teens to mid-30s were prime. Old slaves were discounted like bruised fruit, unless they were Greek and knew philosophy. Then they magically became wise. Health was obvious. A healthy, strong slave cost more. Suffering from chronic cough? That's a markdown. Missing an eye? You're now in the bargain bin. Limp? You're a doorstop with opinions. Appearance also mattered. A lot. Good-looking slaves, especially women and young boys, were creepily more expensive because Rome, like every empire, had a certain appetite. Slaves with symmetrical features and strong jaws could find themselves purchased by nobles, courtesans, or someone just looking for a pretty face to serve olives. Essentially, if you were hot, you were worth more, whether you liked it or not. Then came skills. Could you read, cook, play the lyre without causing internal bleeding? Prices soared for anyone with a specialized craft: doctors, scribes, teachers, dancers. Talents could triple or quadruple a slave's value. In modern terms, imagine listing your resume, but instead of a job, you're being sold. Knows Excel might earn you a better cage. Lastly, origin. Where you came from mattered. Gauls and Germans were often seen as brutes, good for hauling things, not great for poetry. Greeks, however, were intellectual gold. A Greek slave could fetch premium prices, even if he spent half his day sighing and judging Roman syntax. Oh, and there was always the nota censoria, a slave's report card. It listed behavior, background, even past illnesses. No ancient Carfax, but still enough to know if your new butler had previously tried to strangle his last master with a wine jug. In the Roman Empire, if you were a woman and a slave, congratulations. You had an entire buffet of unfortunate job descriptions, most of which involved either serving soup or surviving unwanted attention. Your price tag depended not just on what you could do, but on what your owner thought you could do, which was often worse. Let's start with the more respectable side of things. Female slaves in kitchens, laundries, weaving rooms, and nurseries were household staples. Think of them as the domestic backbone of any Roman villa. Skilled cooks and wet nurses fetched higher prices, because no Roman patrician wanted their baby breastfed by someone with uncultured milk, obviously. But even here, things weren't safe. A cook might also be expected to serve wine in the nude, or worse, recite poetry while fanning sweaty senators, depending on the household's level of depravity. Spoiler, it was usually high. Now, about that other market, the one everyone pretends didn't exist but definitely did, the concubine market. Female slaves with beauty, youth, and docility, read, terror in their eyes and no family left, were often sold with implications not found on polite invoices. The euphemism in auction listings? Pulchra forma, of beautiful form. If your sales slip had that, you were not going to be peeling onions for a living. Prices varied wildly. Some concubines cost as much as trained musicians or Greek philosophers, because wealthy Roman men had one key priority: bragging rights. Nothing screamed, "I'm important," like a slave girl with a flute, a good singing voice, and the tragic backstory of a conquered kingdom. Of course, concubinage was technically legal, but calling it that is like calling a guillotine an aggressive haircut. Female slaves couldn't consent, couldn't refuse, and certainly couldn't unionize. Their bodies were property. Their futures were negotiable. Some were lucky enough to be manumitted, freed, and even married by their former masters, often after years of service, devotion, and the realization that no free Roman woman would put up with that guy. Others lived out their lives in quiet corners of villas, praying the next buyer wasn't worse. In short, being a female slave in Rome meant living on a tightrope, balancing obedience, usefulness, and just enough invisibility to survive. All while someone haggled your worth like you were a used amphora with nice curves. Ah, eunuchs. Nothing says trustworthy household staff in ancient Rome like a man who's been surgically removed from temptation. These men were, let's say, edited for content, and were often considered premium property in specific settings. If you're wondering why someone would pay more for someone missing some rather vital bits, welcome to Rome, where logic occasionally took a holiday. Let's start with the basics. Eunuchs were usually castrated before puberty, ensuring they remained smooth, high-voiced, and non-threatening. Basically a walking lute with arms. This, oddly enough, made them ideal for palace life. Noble women felt safe around them, a relative term considering the empire's moral flexibility, and they were prized as personal attendants, singers, and occasionally accountants. Because nothing says great with numbers, like profound emotional trauma and an inability to father children. They were also used in temples, imperial courts, and wealthy households. You wanted someone around your wife, daughters, or concubines who wouldn't try anything. So what's the solution? Castrate a child, raise him in captivity, and hope he learns table manners. That was the logic. And yes, the Romans paid handsomely for that privilege. Prices. Let's talk coin. Eunuchs often fetched more than ordinary slaves of the same age, especially if imported from the East. Parthian eunuchs were particularly fashionable. A young, well-trained eunuch could cost as much as a skilled Greek tutor or a gladiator with washboard abs. If they could sing in tune or recite Homer without choking on a syllable, the price only went up. Extra points if they were quiet, obedient, and came with a full temple blessing. Of course, not all eunuchs were destined for high society. Some ended up in bureaucratic posts, managing estates, treasuries, or even sensitive state documents. Apparently, the theory was, if he can't be tempted by lust, maybe he won't be tempted by bribes either. A theory that, like many Roman policies, looked better on a scroll than in real life. In short, eunuchs were expensive, delicate, and oddly respected in certain circles, like porcelain dolls who could do taxes. Their price was shaped by rarity, skill, and the twisted desire for loyalty that came prepackaged with mutilation. So yes, in Rome, your resale value could go up precisely because something else went missing. Buying a slave in ancient Rome wasn't as simple as strolling into a shop and pointing at the guy with good teeth. No, it was more like choosing between an uncomfortable public circus or a shady backroom deal. and both came with wildly different price tags. Let's start with the public auction, the empire's version of a clearance sale with togas and moral decay. These were usually held in busy markets, most famously the Forum or at the Aerarium, Rome's state treasury. Slaves stood on raised platforms, sometimes naked, sometimes tagged with descriptions, like good at ironing or doesn't bite much. There were even placards hanging from their necks. These were called tituli and listed basic details: age, skills, health problems, and any other quirks a buyer might want to know. Has nightmares and hates goats might not boost your price, but at least it was honest advertising. In public auctions, prices were competitive, but not always fair. It was a spectacle. Wealthy Romans showed off, middle-class hopefuls looked for bargains, and seasoned traders flipped humans like they were collecting rare amphorae. Bidding wars could break out over a handsome boy or a skilled cook, or both, if Rome was feeling particularly spicy that day. Then there were the private sales. These happened in homes, temples, or behind velvet curtains, where the really custom deals went down. Want a philosopher who can also play the lyre? Or a girl who could read Latin and pour wine seductively? You'd likely find her off-market, for a price. Private sales were more discreet, which meant higher prices. Sellers could embellish a slave's talents without too many prying eyes, and buyers were often rich enough to not care. Plus, no public humiliation, just personal exploitation, which apparently counted as classier. There were even wholesale dealers, called mangones, who specialized in improving slaves before resale. Think of them as ancient human flippers, cleaning them up, training them to say yes, master, with the right amount of terror, and selling them at a markup. Were they ethical? Absolutely not. Were they rich? Definitely. In the end, whether bought under the hot sun in a public forum or whispered about in a silk-draped atrium, a slave's value wasn't just about skill or appearance. It was about who was watching and how guilty the buyer wanted to feel. You might think that a civilization with public baths, lion-based justice and vomitoriums would be a little casual about paperwork. But when it came to slave sales, Rome kept receipts, and they were terrifyingly detailed. Enter the tabulae, the wax tablets or papyrus documents that recorded transactions in the same way we'd keep a bill of sale for a used chariot or a suspicious Amazon purchase at 3 a.m. Every slave sale, whether public auction or private negotiation, was documented with precise Roman flair. Names, prices, seller, buyer, physical condition, and any disclosed defects. Yes, slave defects were a thing, because nothing says civilized empire like a return policy on humans. Was your new cook secretly blind? Did your Greek tutor have a gambling problem? If the seller failed to mention it, you could sue for fraud under Roman contract law. And nothing ruins a toga party like a lawsuit over a depressed eunuch. The receipts weren't just for legality, they were tax-related too. Rome, never one to miss a revenue opportunity, levied a 5% sales tax on slave purchases. This was known as the centesima rerum venalium, and it helped fund such noble causes as building roads, paying legionaries, and occasionally bribing the Senate. And yes, the taxman checked the receipts, especially if the sale was public. Private sales were a little looser with the rules, but if you didn't register it properly, expect to be greeted by an official with a wax tablet and a suspicious look. So, you suddenly have 3 new servants and no paperwork? How very unfortunate. Receipts also gave us historians a treasure trove of information. Archaeologists have found sales records scratched onto pottery shards, written into estate ledgers, and buried in layers of papyrus in dusty Egyptian storehouses. These dusty Roman spreadsheets don't just show prices, they tell stories. Stories of exploitation, sure, but also of just how bureaucratic Rome could be. One receipt from Pompeii even listed the refund window for a sickly slave, 30 days. After that, it was your problem. No returns, no exchanges, no whining. In a twist that would confuse modern HR departments, Roman slaves could, under certain conditions, buy their own freedom. Yes, you heard that right. You could be considered someone's property, but also have your own bank account. Welcome to Rome, where irony had citizenship. This wasn't freedom granted from the goodness of a master's heart, though there was a bit of that too, usually after a lot of guilt, bribery, or a near-death experience. No, we're talking about self-purchase, a system called peculium. This was a little pile of money that a slave could accumulate, technically still owned by the master, but often left alone as long as the slave didn't do anything wild like start a business empire or fund a rebellion. Slaves could earn peculium in several ways. Skilled workers like scribes, teachers, or doctors were sometimes allowed to take side gigs. Domestic slaves might receive tips or small gifts. Gladiators earned it by not dying, which is honestly the most Roman bonus system imaginable. Now here's the kicker. Once a slave saved up enough to match their own market value, they could offer to buy their freedom. It was like turning yourself in at a pawn shop and hoping the owner accepted store credit. If the master agreed, the slave was manumitted, freed, but often still bound by certain legal obligations. Think of it as ancient Rome's version of paying off your student loans, but with less paperwork and slightly more whipping. But, and there's always a but, not all slaves were given the chance. If you were a prized cook or concubine, your master might not be eager to part with you, especially if you made good stew or good conversation. Also, the whole process depended on permission. No matter how much money you had, if your owner said no, the only thing you were free to do was sulk quietly and maybe spit in their wine. Still, many slaves did manage to buy their freedom. Some even went on to become wealthy freedmen, owning businesses and, get this, buying slaves of their own. Because nothing says thank you society like continuing the cycle. In the Roman world, manumission, the act of freeing a slave, wasn't just a nice gesture from a sentimental master with a soft spot for his personal barber. It was an economic transaction, complete with tax implications, legal gymnastics, and, of course, the possibility of a future awkward dinner party where your ex-slave now outranks you socially. Let's begin with the mechanics. A slave could be freed in several ways: by will, by formal ceremony, or just by a master declaring, "You're free," in front of witnesses, ideally without wine involved. These newly freed individuals became liberti, freedmen and freedwomen. But don't confuse that with full citizenship. They didn't get the political rights of born citizens, just the ability to pay taxes and owe their former master favours until death. Yay, freedom. But why would a master give up free labour? Simple: money and legacy. Manumitting a slave meant fewer mouths to feed, and sometimes more money to earn. Freedmen often remained tied to their ex-masters as clients, offering services, loyalty, and maybe baking tips. In return, they got legal status, some rights, and the immense privilege of not being whipped before breakfast. Now let's talk taxes, because Rome would never pass up a chance to dip into your wallet. There was a 5% manumission tax imposed by the state. If a slave bought their own freedom, that tax came out of their saved peculium. If the master freed them voluntarily, he paid the tax, which is probably why sudden acts of benevolence often occurred right before death, when tax concerns faded along with the heartbeat. The manumission economy also created a weird social ladder. Freedmen could become incredibly rich. Some ran shipping empires, others owned apartment blocks, and one even became Rome's imperial secretary, proving once and for all that the real way to climb in Roman society was through tenacity and not dying in a salt mine. Of course, the catch was you were expected to show eternal gratitude to your former master. Legally, morally, and socially, you still owed them a bit of your soul, and definitely some free labour if they needed their floors scrubbed or their grapes peeled. Let's not sugarcoat it. The Roman slave economy was a well-oiled machine of exploitation, a system where human beings were itemised, taxed, appraised, and traded like livestock wearing sandals. It wasn't a glitch in the Roman system, it was the system, and it built the empire's roads, fed its patricians, and fanned the grapes into their mouths. Slavery was so normalised in Roman society that no one really questioned it. except, occasionally, the philosophers who still had dinner served to them by a trembling, unpaid human. Stoic musings on freedom of the soul went hand in hand with handing someone a mop and telling them to philosophize after they cleaned the atrium. The legacy, unfortunately, didn't stay neatly boxed in marble ruins and Latin inscriptions. Rome's model of slavery, the idea that people could be reduced to labor, obedience, and a fluctuating market value, became a reference point for centuries. European powers later borrowed the legal, moral, and economic justifications when building their own empires. The Roman Empire may be dead, but the ghost of its slave markets haunted history long after the last toga fell off the runway. Even worse, the romanticized image of Rome, majestic columns, powerful legions, inspiring rhetoric, often leaves out the blood-soaked foundation. Tour guides will happily show you the Colosseum's arches, but won't mention the slave labor behind the stonework, or the slaves who died making the emperors look impressive in public. And yet, for all the calculated cruelty, Rome couldn't exist without its slaves. They were the economic backbone, the domestic support system, and, let's be honest, the reason elite Romans didn't have to lift a finger unless it was to signal for more wine. So what's the lesson here? That civilizations can achieve greatness, while stepping on countless lives to get there. That opulence can be built on suffering, and that maybe, just maybe, we shouldn't idealize empires without checking the fine print. Rome may have burned, but its practices echoed on, and somewhere between the scrolls and statues lies the truth. The cost of a slave wasn't just in silver, it was in humanity, lost and commodified. Imagine yourself stepping into the warm glow of an Athenian evening. The streets outside are noisy with vendors and gossip, but once you cross the threshold of the Andron, the men's quarter of a wealthy citizen's home, you enter another world entirely. Oil lamps cast a golden shimmer against plastered walls, painted with mythic scenes, garlands of ivy and roses perfume the air, and the faint strum of a lyre sets the rhythm for the night ahead. This wasn't just a casual drinking hangout. The symposium was ritual, theatre, and intellectual combat all rolled into one. Guests did not simply stroll in. They prepared for hours, washing, anointing themselves with fragrant oils, arranging their hair, and even choosing wreaths of myrtle or violets to crown their heads. Appearance mattered. Every detail announced status. When you reclined on the couch, you weren't just drinking wine. You were performing your role in a drama of wit, elegance, and reputation. The layout of the Andron itself reflected hierarchy. Couches, called kleinae, were arranged in a horseshoe around a central mixing bowl, the great crater. The position of each guest was a subtle signal of rank and honour, determined by the host. At one end of the room, the musicians or entertainers would be stationed, ready to play flutes, recite Homeric verses, or perform dances that blurred the line between art and seduction. The host, always male, always someone with enough wealth to put on a display, set the tone. Some symposia were dignified affairs, where philosophy, poetry, and debate carried the evening. These could feel like a lecture hall drenched in wine, where guests sparred with words sharper than swords. Other nights, however, things veered toward chaos. With too much drink and too many egos in the room, insults were hurled, couches overturned, and the noble symposium dissolved into drunken brawls. But whatever the mood, one truth held firm. The symposium was never about wine alone. It was about community and competition. Every guest sought to impress, whether with clever lines of poetry, biting humour, or simply how gracefully he drained his cup. To be invited was an honour. To perform well was a chance at fame. To fail meant ridicule. In this charged atmosphere, the symposium became a mirror of Athenian society itself. Brilliant, messy, competitive, and endlessly human. Once the guests had settled into their couches, crowned with garlands and perfumed with oils, the heart of the symposium revealed itself. The wine. But this wasn't a matter of simply popping open a jug and passing it around. For the Athenians, how you mixed your wine was as important as the wine itself. Drinking unmixed wine, straight from the jar, was considered barbaric, something only uncivilized Thracians or desperate drunkards would do. True Greek sophistication demanded balance. At the centre of the andron sat the crater, a massive mixing bowl often as tall as a man's waist, decorated with mythological scenes of Dionysus, the god of wine, and his riotous followers. Into this vessel, servants poured rich dark wine from amphorae, followed by water drawn from the household well. The precise ratio of wine to water became the evening's first decision. Should the mixture be 3 parts water to 1 part wine, ensuring a gentle buzz and witty conversation? Or 2 to 1, risking a more spirited, rowdy night? Rarely was it equal parts, for that level of potency could unleash bedlam before the evening had even begun. The responsibility for this decision lay with the symposiarch, the master of the feast. Chosen either by lot or appointed by the host, the symposiarch's job was both enviable and perilous. He was part referee, part dictator of pleasure. Too weak a mix, and guests would complain that the night was dull. Too strong, and the couches might turn into battlegrounds before the musicians even played their first notes. To govern the measure of intoxication was, in a way, to govern the flow of the night itself. Once mixed, the wine was ladled into individual jugs and poured into kyllikes, broad, shallow cups with delicate handles. These cups were more than functional. Many were painted with playful or scandalous images at the bottom, a satyr in mid-dance, a drunken reveller tumbling headfirst, or a god raising his cup would only appear once the drinker had drained his own. In this way, the very act of finishing your wine became entertainment, a small surprise waiting at the bottom of the bowl. Thus, before a single toast was raised, the stage was set. The wine was not just drink, it was a carefully measured companion, coaxing the evening toward philosophy or chaos, depending on the will of the symposiarch. Balance was the key, and in Athens, balance was everything. With the couches filled and the wine flowing, the true spirit of the symposium began to unfold: conversation. For Athenians, drinking was never just about dulling the senses. The goal was stimulation, of wit, of debate, of memory. Guests reclined side by side, kylix in hand, and launched into topics ranging from the sublime to the scandalous. Sometimes the conversation began lightly. A guest might recite a witty line of poetry, quote Homer, or challenge another to complete a riddle. Others would compete in telling stories of love affairs, military campaigns, or political gossip. Laughter was frequent, but so was sharpness. Athenians prized logos, the art of persuasive speech, and no symposium was complete without verbal sparring. A well-placed insult, delivered with elegance, could earn applause louder than any song. At more serious gatherings, philosophy took centre stage. These symposia became miniature academies where men tested ideas under the influence of Dionysus. Questions floated in the smoky lamplight. What is love? What is justice? Does the soul survive after death? It was in such settings that figures like Socrates, Alcibiades, and Plato made their mark. Plato's Symposium, one of the most famous texts in philosophy, is itself a record of a drinking party, where each guest gave a speech on the nature of love. Beneath the ivy crowns and wine-drenched banter, the foundations of Western thought were being laid. But even the deepest philosophy was not divorced from competition. Each guest sought to impress, not just with wisdom, but with style. A clever analogy, a daring argument, or a perfectly timed joke might win the night. In this way, conversation was a contest as much as a collaboration, a verbal duel with wine as the fuel. Still, conversation at the symposium could just as easily veer into scandal. Political intrigue was a common topic, as were tales of adultery, betrayal, and corruption. Some evenings became less about lofty ideas and more about tearing reputations to shreds. After all, wine loosened tongues, and in a society where reputation was everything, what was whispered at a symposium could echo loudly in the streets of Athens the next day. Thus, conversation at the symposium was never neutral. It was play and performance, philosophy and politics, laughter and danger. One moment you might find yourself debating the nature of the soul, and the next you could be defending your honour from a sly remark about your latest affair. This was the power of the symposium. Every word, like every sip of wine, carried weight. As the wine mellowed tongues and conversations grew more animated, the air filled with another essential element of the symposium: music. No gathering was complete without it. Once the first cups had been drained, hired musicians, usually young women or enslaved performers, entered carrying their instruments. The haunting double pipes of the aulos, the plucked strings of the kithara or lyre, and sometimes drums that beat softly in rhythm with the rising voices. The aulos in particular had a hypnotic effect. Its sound was sharp, almost piercing, designed not for quiet meditation, but to rouse the senses. Plato himself distrusted its intoxicating tones, believing it encouraged excess. But for most Athenians, that was precisely the point. As the flutes whined and the strings thrummed, men reclined deeper into their couches, carried along on waves of melody and wine. Entertainment at symposia was varied and unpredictable. Some nights, poets were invited to recite verses of Homer or compose impromptu couplets on themes chosen by the guests. Other nights, dancers performed, sometimes acrobatic, sometimes sensual, always meant to hold the gaze of a half-drunken audience. Courtesans, too, were common presences, blending conversation with seduction, their laughter punctuating the rhythm of the music. Yet music at a symposium was never passive background noise. It became woven into the rituals of drinking. Guests often engaged in scholia, improvised drinking songs passed around the circle like a verbal game. One man would sing a line, often humorous or provocative, and the next was challenged to respond with a verse of equal wit. To falter was embarrassing. To shine meant glory in the eyes of peers. In this way, the music became a contest of cleverness, just as conversation had been. Even the cups themselves joined the fun. Some kylikes were painted with musical scenes, so that as a guest drank, a hidden flute player or dancing satyr appeared at the bottom. Draining your wine revealed not just the painted image, but often a round of applause, laughter, or a bawdy joke from the others. Still, music carried more than entertainment. It touched on the divine. To the Greeks, music was linked to cosmic harmony, a reminder of Dionysus and Apollo alike, the god of frenzy and the god of order. At the symposium, that tension was alive. The flute might push men toward frenzy, while the lyre sought to steady their hearts. Between the two, balance, or chaos, was struck. Once the music had loosened the air and conversation had taken its course, the symposium often shifted into another beloved pastime: games. Wine did not only fuel philosophy and poetry, it also sharpened the thrill of competition. And in Athens, where nearly everything was a contest, the symposium was no exception. One of the most popular games was kotobos. The rules were simple, yet it required finesse. A guest would swirl the dregs of his wine in a kylix, then fling them across the room with a flick of the wrist, aiming at a target, often a bronze disc balanced on a stand. If the wine struck true, the disc clanged loudly. The sound met with cheers and laughter. But a sloppy throw, splattering the wall or another guest, could earn ridicule for the rest of the evening. The game was more than play. It was a test of grace and precision, a chance to show control even in drunkenness. Other contests were more direct. Who could drain a cup the fastest? Who could remain the most eloquent while visibly staggering from wine? Some symposiarchs delighted in pushing their guests to the edge of excess, decreeing rounds of increasingly potent mixtures. Others favoured skill over endurance, devising intellectual or poetic challenges between drinks. Either way, the spirit of agon, struggle and competition, was always present. There were also games of wit, which blended seamlessly with conversation. Guests might challenge each other to invent verses on the spot, insult one another in rhyme, or respond to riddles crafted to expose quickness of mind. These contests blurred the line between play and performance, between joke and humiliation. To win was to bask in laughter and admiration. To fail meant enduring the sharp-tongued mockery of peers. Yet, contests were not always so light-hearted. When politics or personal rivalry simmered beneath the surface, a drinking game could turn ugly. A spill, an insult hidden in a verse, or a failed boast might escalate quickly. What began as a playful challenge could end in fists, broken cups, and blood on the floor. Dionysus, after all, was a god of frenzy as much as joy, and the symposium constantly balanced between order and chaos. Thus, the games of the symposium were never merely diversions. They were miniature dramas in themselves, moments where wine tested not only the body, but the reputation of each guest. Every throw, every song, every boast was a chance at triumph or humiliation under the watchful eyes of friends, rivals, and Dionysus himself. If wine was the lifeblood of the symposium, then love and desire were its restless spirit. No gathering was free from the presence, or at least the discussion, of Eros. Courtesans, musicians, and dancers often drifted among the couches, not just as entertainers, but as participants in the atmosphere of flirtation and seduction. The symposium blurred the lines between the intellectual and the erotic, between philosophy and passion. For many guests, courtesans were more than ornaments. Known as hetairae, they were women trained in wit, conversation, and charm, capable of holding their own in dialogue with philosophers as easily as they could captivate with music or dance. Unlike ordinary prostitutes, hetairae had reputations, sometimes commanding great respect and influence. A clever remark from a hetaira could shape the flow of discussion, or reduce a boastful guest to silence. They were both admired companions and social mirrors, reminding men that eloquence was not theirs alone. Yet the symposium was also a place where male desire, especially for youths, was openly discussed. In Athenian culture, relationships between older men and younger male companions carried layers of mentorship, affection, and sexuality. At the symposium, these relationships were flaunted, teased, and celebrated through speeches and jokes. The line between noble praise of beauty and drunken scandal was always thin, and many evenings teetered on both sides of it. Philosophical discussions often wove love into their themes. Plato's Symposium immortalizes one such evening, where each guest offered a speech on the nature of Eros. Some praised love as the force binding the cosmos, others mocked it as a dangerous madness. Socrates, famously, claimed that true love was not about flesh at all, but about ascending toward the divine and eternal. Yet even as lofty words filled the air, the reality of the symposium was far more physical. Laughter, stolen kisses, whispered propositions in the corner of the room. Desire at the symposium was not always gentle. Jealousy, rivalry, and wounded pride often lurked beneath the wreaths and perfumes. A courtesan's favour could spark competition between guests, and a cutting remark about one's beauty, or lack thereof, could ignite more than words. In such moments, the symposium revealed its raw truth. Beneath the philosophy and poetry, it was a crucible of human longing, fragile egos, and the unpredictable power of attraction. Thus, Eros at the symposium was never a mere sideshow. It was the pulse of the evening, binding conversation, music and wine into something far more volatile, a mixture of charm, danger, and revelation. Beneath the ivy crowns, the music, and the sweet haze of wine, the symposium often became a theatre for politics. In Athens, where democracy demanded constant debate, even leisure could not escape the pull of power. Reclining on their couches, men let their tongues wander into dangerous territory, boasting of alliances, whispering conspiracies, or tearing apart rivals who were not present to defend themselves. The wine loosened tongues that daytime restraint kept bound. One guest might boast of his military service, painting himself as indispensable to the city's defense. Another would counter with sly remarks about corruption, hinting at bribes taken in the assembly or the law courts, A man might praise Pericles or Alcibiades or another political leader of the day, only for someone else to remind the room of their scandals, affairs, or disastrous campaigns, and scandal was never far. The symposium was fertile ground for gossip. Who had seduced whose wife? Who had cheated on debts? Who had been caught in disgraceful behaviour at a festival? The more wine flowed, the sharper the accusations became. Witty barbs that began as jokes could shift into daggers. To be ridiculed in such a setting was humiliating, but to win the crowd's laughter at another man's expense could be a kind of political victory. The risks of such talk were real. The symposium was private, but words spoken in its smoky glow had a way of echoing in the daylight streets. Alcibiades himself, brilliant, scandalous, and reckless, was infamous for drunken boasts at symposia, some of which haunted him in trials later. What was said half-jokingly over wine could return as evidence of treachery, impiety, or conspiracy. Yet men returned to these conversations again and again because scandal was irresistible. To hear secrets whispered, to watch a rival squirm, to strike a verbal blow disguised as comedy, all of this gave the symposium its edge. It was not only philosophy and poetry that drew Athenians to these parties, but also the thrill of seeing masks slip, of reputations crumbling under laughter and mockery. Thus, politics at the symposium was both entertainment and danger. It mirrored Athenian democracy itself, messy, loud, competitive, and filled with ego. The symposium may have been private, but it was never separate from the city. In the haze of wine and song, the seeds of political triumph or ruin were often planted. As the hours passed and the crater was refilled again and again, the carefully measured balance of the symposium began to wobble. What had started as polished conversation, witty songs and disciplined games often gave way to slurred speech, unsteady gestures, and eruptions of unrestrained emotion. Dionysus, the god of wine and frenzy, made his presence felt most vividly in these late stages. The line between philosophy and madness blurred. Guests who once quoted Homer with elegance might now shout half-finished verses, their words dissolving into laughter. Others, overcome with wine, grew bold in ways the sober daylight never allowed, confessing forbidden loves, insulting powerful men, or making boasts too wild to be believed. The symposiarch might still attempt to impose order, decreeing another round or demanding a song, but more often than not, he too had surrendered to intoxication. Physical chaos was common. Cups were overturned, wreaths slid askew, and couches became battlegrounds. A careless remark could spark a heated argument. An argument could escalate into thrown cups or fists. Servants scurried nervously, trying to clean up spills or calm tempers before matters grew violent. And yet, for many, this descent was part of the allure. The symposium was never meant to remain perfectly civilized. It was a controlled dive into the unpredictable realm of Dionysus. Sometimes the chaos spilled beyond the walls of the andron. A drunken band of revelers, called a komos, might stagger into the streets, singing bawdy songs, banging on neighbours' doors, and carrying torches through the night. These street parades were both feared and admired, rowdy, disruptive, but also a recognised part of Dionysian culture. To lead or participate in a komos was to wear one's drunkenness as a badge of honour. Of course, not every descent ended in laughter. Some nights brought real danger. A rivalry reignited, an insult too sharp, or a boast too threatening could end with blades drawn. The Athenians themselves acknowledged this risk. Too much wine could transform a symposium from a gathering of equals into a brawl of enemies. Yet even in its disorder, the symposium had meaning. To surrender to chaos was to embrace the god of ecstasy, to taste freedom from the rigid order of daily civic life. The descent into frenzy was both a warning and a revelation. Beneath the masks of philosophy and poetry, men were still creatures of passion, pride, and excess. By the time the oil lamps guttered low and the last notes of the flute faded, the symposium had usually run its course. Guests staggered from the andron, ivy wreaths askew, their robes stained with wine, voices hoarse from song and argument. Some collapsed into sleep on couches, unable to rise until daylight, while others spilled into the streets to join a komos, their drunken parade echoing through Athens until dawn. The morning after was rarely graceful. Servants were left to scrub floors sticky with spilled wine, gather shattered kylakes, and dispose of wreaths wilted in the night's heat. For the participants, the aftermath carried both pride and regret. A sharp remark, made too freely under Dionysus's spell, might become the subject of gossip at the agora the next day. A boast could haunt a man in court or politics. Yet the same symposium might also forge new friendships, strengthen bonds of loyalty, or cement reputations for wit and brilliance. To shine at a symposium was to elevate oneself socially, even politically. To disgrace oneself was to risk ridicule far beyond the walls of the host's home. But the symposium was more than a night of excess. It was a cultural institution. It reflected the very character of Athens: competitive, intellectual, chaotic, and creative. In the balance between wine and water, between philosophy and scandal, Athenians tested the limits of themselves and their society. The greatest ideas of Greek thought, discussions of love, justice, and the soul, were not born in classrooms, but in wine-soaked gatherings, where laughter and argument mingled. Plato's symposium immortalized this truth, showing how an evening of drinking could become a meditation on the nature of Eros itself. Even after Athens' golden age faded, the spirit of the symposium lived on. Later Romans adapted it into their convivia, while echoes of it resurface in medieval banquets, Renaissance salons, and even the modern dinner party. Wherever people gather to drink, to argue, to sing, and to confess too much under the influence of alcohol, the shadow of the symposium lingers. The morning after may have left Athenians bleary-eyed, their reputations dented, their heads heavy, but the memory of the symposium endured. It was never just about the wine, it was about being human, brilliant and foolish, disciplined and chaotic, philosophical and scandalous, all in the same night. In that way, the symposium was Athens itself, distilled into a single room, a single bowl of wine, and a single unforgettable evening. Imagine standing in the dust of a battlefield, the sun blazing overhead, and hearing a sound unlike anything you've ever known, a deep, trumpeting roar that shakes the earth beneath your sandals. For a Roman soldier, this was no ordinary noise. It was the battle cry of Carthage's most fearsome weapon, the war elephant. These creatures were living towers, taller than any horse, covered in armor, with tusks capped in iron and bodies capable of flattening a line of men in seconds. To those seeing them for the first time, they might as well have been mythical beasts, closer to the monsters of Homer than to anything born of this world. The Carthaginians had turned elephants into symbols of power and terror. Imported from Africa, most were the now extinct North African forest elephants, smaller than the massive Indian variety, but still terrifying when outfitted for war. They were dressed in protective armor, with spiked or bladed tusks that transformed their natural bulk into a crushing weapon. Some even carried wooden towers strapped to their backs, holding archers and spearmen who could rain down death from above. The psychological effect of these animals was as important as their physical strength. Horses panicked at their smell, men froze at their sheer size, and the sight of an elephant charging, a wall of flesh and metal thundering forward, was enough to shatter morale before a single blow landed. This was Carthage's advantage, to terrify the enemy into breaking ranks, turning discipline into chaos. But war elephants were more than weapons. They were statements. Marching into battle with elephants declared that Carthage was no mere city-state. It was a superpower capable of commanding nature itself. When generals like Hamilcar or Hannibal deployed them, the message was clear. You were not just fighting soldiers, you were fighting gods of war made flesh. Still, the Romans quickly realized these beasts were not invincible. Their size made them slow, their behavior unpredictable. But in this opening moment, before tactics, before countermeasures, before men adapted, The war elephant stood as the most terrifying shock force of the ancient world. They were not simply animals. They were a roar in the dust, a living nightmare, and for Carthage a weapon meant to crush the will of Rome. Transforming a wild elephant into a weapon of war was no easy feat. Carthage didn't simply unleash untamed giants onto the battlefield. It carefully trained them to become extensions of its army. Captured in the forests and plains of North Africa, young elephants were brought into camps where specialized handlers, called mahouts, began the long process of shaping their behavior. These men lived almost every moment beside the animals, feeding them, grooming them, and most importantly, teaching them to obey commands in the chaos of battle. Training an elephant was equal parts discipline and trust. The mahout guided the animal with vocal calls, prods, and even iron hooks, conditioning it to respond instantly. Elephants learned to march in formation, halt at signals, and charge on command. They were acclimated to the sounds of war, the clash of bronze, the blare of trumpets, the screams of soldiers. Fires were sometimes lit near their pens, so the beasts grew accustomed to smoke and shouting. The goal was simple. Make sure that when the elephant faced the madness of battle, it did not panic and turn against its own side. Armor added another layer of preparation. Craftsmen fitted elephants with bronze or leather headpieces, chest plates, and tusk sheaths tipped with sharp blades or spikes. These modifications transformed the already fearsome creatures into juggernauts. On their backs, wooden towers, known as howdahs, were secured with ropes and straps, carrying 2 to 4 soldiers armed with javelins, bows, or long spears. In this way, each elephant became a mobile fortress, both shock weapon and elevated firing platform. But the most important training was psychological. Mahouts taught elephants to channel their aggression outward. They were driven to frenzy before battle, sometimes by being given wine or being pricked with sharp objects, ensuring they entered the fight already worked into a rage. Once unleashed, they could trample infantry lines, scatter cavalry, and crush fortifications. Of course, the risks were immense. No matter how well trained, an elephant was still a wild animal. If injured or terrified, it might turn back and rampage through its own army, causing as much destruction to friend as to foe. Carthaginian generals understood this gamble, but they also understood the payoff. When properly handled, war elephants were more than beasts. They were terror-made flesh. The first shockwave in a battle plan meant to unnerve and overwhelm Rome before swords even clashed. The first appearances of Carthage's war elephants stunned enemies across the Mediterranean. In the 4th and 3rd centuries BC, when Carthage fought its rivals in Sicily, North Africa, and Iberia, elephants quickly became its signature weapon. Against lightly armoured infantry or cavalry unused to such beasts, their effect was devastating. Imagine a Greek hoplite phalanx, trained to hold the line against men, suddenly confronted with an animal weighing several tons, trumpeting, charging, and crushing everything in its path. Spears splintered, shields were knocked aside, and horses bolted in terror. One of the earliest documented uses was during Carthage's campaigns in Sicily against Greek city-states. Here, the elephants were unleashed to break through heavily defended positions, scattering men before them and leaving gaps that Carthaginian infantry could exploit. They were not merely weapons of destruction, but tools of strategy, softening up an enemy line before the decisive clash. Their appearance became so iconic that Greek writers often described them with awe, comparing them to living siege engines. In North Africa, elephants were equally effective. Against rebellious tribes or rival armies unfamiliar with the beasts, they instilled instant fear. Even when they didn't kill in large numbers, the psychological shock of their presence often decided battles before they truly began. Enemies sometimes fled at the mere sight of them, unwilling to test their courage against these colossal adversaries. Yet the early successes also revealed their limitations. In narrow terrain, elephants could be trapped or avoided. Clever opponents set ambushes, targeting the mahouts or wounding the animals until they panicked. But when deployed on open fields, where there was space to charge, they were nearly unstoppable. Carthage, learning quickly, began to shape its battlefield tactics around their use. Combining elephants with disciplined infantry, and swift cavalry to create a combined arms strategy that few enemies could match. These early victories cemented elephants as more than just exotic beasts. They became symbols of Carthaginian power. Other nations might have strong infantry or swift cavalry, but only Carthage had elephants, and that gave them a terrifying edge. For Rome, watching these encounters from across the sea, the message was clear. One day, they too would face these living towers. And when that day came, no amount of drill or discipline could prepare them for the shock of a charging elephant line. No story of Carthaginian elephants is more legendary than Hannibal's audacious march across the Alps during the Second Punic War. In 218 BC, Hannibal set out to strike at the very heart of Rome, not by sailing across the Mediterranean, but by leading his army, infantry, cavalry, and elephants over the treacherous mountain passes of Gaul and into Italy. It was a gamble so outrageous that even today it feels closer to myth than history. The elephants, around 37 in number, were not just animals in this march. They were symbols of defiance. To Hannibal, they were meant to terrify the Romans before a single spear was thrown. Imagine the spectacle. Colossal beasts trudging through icy paths, their bulk silhouetted against snow-covered peaks, drivers urging them forward as avalanches thundered in the distance. For the soldiers alongside them, exhausted and freezing, the elephants were proof of their commander's iron will. If these creatures could endure the climb, so too could men. But the journey was brutal. Narrow trails barely wide enough for men had to be hacked open for the elephants. Slippery slopes threatened to send them plummeting into ravines. The cold was relentless. Beasts used to African heat shivered in the mountain winds, their trunks raised helplessly against the snow. Food was scarce, and keeping such massive animals fed and watered was a near impossible task. Some elephants perished on the journey, collapsing from exhaustion or tumbling to their deaths. Yet many survived. When Hannibal finally descended into the Po Valley in northern Italy, the sight of elephants emerging from the mountains shocked the Roman world. These were not just soldiers arriving on their border, but monsters of war, carried over landscapes the Romans had believed impassable. The psychological impact was enormous. News spread like wildfire. Hannibal had brought living fortresses into Italy itself. Though the march had cost Carthage dearly, the symbolism was worth its weight in gold. The elephants were proof of Hannibal's genius, his willingness to do what no other commander dared. They did not simply arrive as weapons, they arrived as omens. Rome now faced not just an enemy army, but one led by a man who could bend nature itself to his will. In December 218 BC, Hannibal's gamble with the Alps bore fruit at the Battle of Trebia, his first major clash with Roman forces on Italian soil. After weeks of maneuvering, he finally lured the Romans into open battle near the Trebia River in northern Italy. Exhausted, half-frozen, and hungry from crossing the icy waters at dawn, the Roman legions found themselves facing not only Hannibal's disciplined army, but also his surviving war elephants. Though their numbers had dwindled since the Alpine crossing, the elephants still played a decisive psychological role. Stationed on Hannibal's flanks, the beasts became walls of flesh, towering over Roman cavalry. At the signal, they charged, trumpeting, tusks glinting with metal caps, trampling forward as archers atop their backs rained missiles into enemy ranks. For many Roman soldiers, this was their first direct encounter with elephants, and panic rippled through the lines. Horses bolted at the smell and sound of the animals, throwing cavalry units into chaos before they could even engage. The Romans tried to counter with discipline, bracing shields and thrusting spears upward. Some elephants fell under the barrage, pierced and maddened, but even in death they sowed destruction, collapsing onto soldiers, crushing shields and men alike. Those that survived rampaged unpredictably, scattering formations that relied on tight cohesion. Once the lines were fractured, Hannibal unleashed his cavalry and hidden reserves, surrounding the disoriented Romans and cutting them to pieces. Though the elephants were not the primary killers, their impact was undeniable. They destabilized the battlefield, turning Roman order into confusion. softening the enemy just long enough for Hannibal's tactical genius to deliver the decisive blow. Ancient sources note that after Trebia, the Romans were left shaken not only by defeat, but by the memory of those colossal beasts roaring through their lines. The image of elephants crushing soldiers into the frozen mud lingered long after the battle ended, but the victory came at a cost. The harsh Italian winter and lack of fodder proved disastrous for Hannibal's elephants. Most of the animals that had terrified Rome at Trebia soon perished in the cold months that followed, leaving him with only one survivor by spring, a massive creature nicknamed Surus, said to be his favourite. Yet even as their numbers dwindled, their legend grew. Hannibal had shown Rome that elephants were more than weapons. They were instruments of fear, capable of bending even disciplined legions to chaos. By the spring of 217 BC, Hannibal's once imposing herd of elephants had been whittled down by cold, hunger, and disease. Only a single survivor remained, a massive beast remembered by the Carthaginians as Surus, meaning the Syrian. Whether the name referred to his breed, his origins, or simply his appearance is debated, but Surus became more than an animal. He was a symbol of Hannibal's resilience and defiance in the heart of enemy territory. Surus was said to have been the largest and most imposing of the herd, possibly a war elephant of Syrian or Indian stock acquired through trade, rather than the smaller North African species. His sheer size and endurance set him apart. Roman sources claimed that Hannibal even used Surus as a kind of battlefield platform. With his vision failing from an eye disease, the general supposedly directed armies while perched on Surus's back, shaded beneath a canopy and elevated above the chaos. Whether this detail is fact or legend, it underscores the deep impression the elephant left on contemporaries. On the battlefield, Surus carried more than just Hannibal. He carried morale. For the Carthaginian soldiers who had endured the horrors of the Alps, his survival was proof that their cause was favoured by the gods. To the Romans, he was a living reminder of the terror at Trebia, a hulking shadow of Hannibal's earlier victories. Even alone, he amplified the aura of Carthage's commander, transforming him into a figure who seemed untouchable, larger than life. But despite Surus's symbolic power, he was still only one elephant. As Hannibal advanced deeper into Italy, fighting at Lake Trasimene and eventually Cannae, elephants no longer played the decisive role they once had. The Italian climate, the lack of proper fodder, and the relentless pace of campaigning made it nearly impossible to keep such beasts alive in the long term. Surus, though beloved, could not reverse that reality. Eventually, even his legend faded into uncertainty. Sources fall silent on when or how he died, but his story lived on as the emblem of Hannibal's daring. While Rome adapted and developed strategies to neutralize elephants, Surus remained the haunting memory of their first devastating encounters. In many ways, he was not just Hannibal's last elephant in Italy. He was the last echo of Carthage's boldest gamble to terrify Rome into submission. At first, Rome had no idea how to fight elephants. Legionaries trained to face men with swords and spears suddenly found themselves staring down charging towers of muscle and ivory. Their initial instinct was to panic, and Hannibal exploited that fear brilliantly. But Rome was nothing if not adaptable. By the later years of the Second Punic War, Roman commanders had developed clever countermeasures that transformed the elephant from a weapon of terror into a liability. One of the simplest tactics was to open lanes in the legion's formation. When elephants charged, instead of holding a solid line, Roman soldiers stepped aside, creating corridors that funneled the beasts harmlessly through the ranks. Once past, the elephants could be harassed with javelins and slings until they either collapsed or fled. The key was discipline, resisting the urge to scatter and instead turning chaos into controlled maneuver. Roman missile troops also became crucial. Velites, lightly armed skirmishers, were trained to target elephants specifically. They hurled spears at sensitive points: the eyes, the trunk, the underbelly. Even if these wounds did not kill the animal outright, they caused pain and panic. A wounded elephant often turned back on its own lines, wreaking havoc on the Carthaginian infantry standing behind it. The Romans realized that the elephant's greatest strength, its size and ferocity, could also be turned into its greatest weakness. Another brutal tactic was psychological warfare against the animals themselves. Trumpets, horns, and even the blaring clash of shields were used to spook the beasts, making them uncontrollable. In some battles, pits were dug and disguised with brush, designed to trap charging elephants in the ground before they reached Roman lines. Against cavalry, Rome deployed spiked caltrops, iron devices meant to maim the elephant's massive feet. Perhaps most importantly, Rome adapted its mindset. The first time soldiers saw elephants, they viewed them as monsters. By the later campaigns, they treated them as just another enemy unit to be neutralized. As Roman discipline hardened, the terror factor diminished. In the end, elephants that once shattered Roman armies at Trebia were far less effective in later encounters. Rome's genius lay not in avoiding defeat, but in learning from it, turning initial panic into seasoned preparation. By the final years of the war, the sight of elephants no longer promised Carthaginian victory. Instead, they had become unpredictable gambles, as likely to trample their own men as to crush Rome. By 202 BC, the Second Punic War had dragged on for nearly 2 decades. Hannibal, recalled from Italy, faced Rome's rising general Scipio Africanus in North Africa. The two greatest commanders of their age would clash at Zama, a battle that would decide the fate of Carthage, and once again, elephants would play their part. Hannibal had assembled around 80 of them, hoping to repeat the terror of Trebia and Trasimene. It was one final gamble to break Roman lines and reclaim the initiative. As the battle began, the elephants were driven forward in a massive charge. Dust filled the air as the ground thundered beneath their feet, tusks gleaming with metal tips, trumpets echoing like thunderclaps across the plain. To Carthage, it was a show of overwhelming force. To Rome, it was a familiar test. This time, Scipio was ready. He had studied Hannibal's tactics for years, and he knew the elephant's weaknesses. Instead of forming a solid wall, Scipio ordered his legions to open corridors in their ranks. At the same time, his trumpeters blared horns to unsettle the beasts. Confused, many elephants veered into the gaps harmlessly, charging through empty lanes before being driven off with javelins. Others, spooked by the noise, turned back in panic, trampling Carthage's own cavalry and sowing chaos in their rear lines. The once feared living tanks became liabilities. Only a handful made contact with Roman soldiers, and even then, they were quickly overwhelmed by disciplined spear formations. The rest either bolted or were cut down. What was meant to be Hannibal's opening blow collapsed into disorder before the real fighting even began. Without their elephant shockwave, Carthage lost the psychological edge. The battle turned into a clash of infantry and cavalry, where Scipio's superior tactics and Numidian allies carried the day. Hannibal's army was crushed. Carthage was forced into humiliating peace terms, and the age of Carthaginian elephants effectively ended. At Zama, the war elephant met its reckoning. What had once terrified Rome now symbolized Carthage's desperation. Rome had learned, adapted, and conquered. The beasts that had shaken legions to their core at Trebia and Trasimene could no longer decide the fate of battles. Instead, they became the tragic icons of a fading empire, remembered not for their triumphs, but for their final, futile charge. With the defeat at Zama, Carthage's war elephants faded from the battlefield, but their legend endured long after their trumpets fell silent. They had been more than beasts of burden or exotic curiosities. For nearly a century, they were Carthage's most iconic symbol of power, living fortresses that carried both glory and danger into every campaign. The elephant embodied Carthage's strengths and weaknesses. On one hand, they projected dominance. No other Mediterranean power could field such a terrifying weapon with such regularity. Their presence struck fear before a battle even began, and for years Rome trembled at the thought of facing them. On the other hand, they revealed Carthage's reliance on spectacle. Elephants were unpredictable, expensive to maintain, and devastating when they panicked. At Zama, they showed that Rome's discipline could turn even Carthage's most fearsome weapon into a liability. Still, their impact on history cannot be overstated. The sight of elephants marching across the Alps with Hannibal became one of antiquity's most enduring images. Roman poets, historians, and generals retold the story for centuries, turning those beasts into symbols of audacity and terror. Even after the animals themselves disappeared from Carthaginian battlefields, their memory lived on as cautionary tales about the limits of brute force. Rome itself adopted elephants occasionally, but never with the same devotion. They used captured beasts in triumphal parades, and sometimes in battle. But the lesson of Zama remained. Discipline and adaptability mattered more than spectacle. As the empire expanded, elephants became less weapons of war and more emblems of victory, paraded in the arenas for public entertainment rather than unleashed on foreign fields. The Carthaginian elephant, then, occupies a unique place in history. It was both terrifying and flawed, magnificent and impractical. To Carthage, it was a gamble worth taking, an effort to bend nature into a weapon that might offset Rome's rising power. To Rome, it was a challenge that forced innovation, shaping the discipline that would define their legions for centuries. In the end, war elephants did not save Carthage, but they did secure its place in legend. Whenever we think of Hannibal, of Carthage, of the ancient struggle against Rome, the image that rises first is not of infantry or cavalry, but of elephants, colossal, armoured, trumpeting in the dust, charging toward destiny. In the medieval world, bread was not just food, it was the foundation of existence, the one staple that tied together the lives of peasants, clergy, and nobles alike. A man might go days without meat, cheese, or even vegetables, but he could not live without bread. To run out of loaves was to flirt with starvation, and whole communities measured the rhythm of life by the grain harvest, the mill, and the oven. For the poor, bread was often coarse and dark. Rye, barley, and oats were the grains most accessible to peasants, producing loaves that were dense, sour, and sometimes flecked with husks or straw. These black breads filled the stomach, but offered little in the way of refinement. In hard times, households stretched their flour with beans, acorns, or even ground-up weeds, an act of desperation that made the bread heavy and bitter. Eating such loaves was a reminder of one's low station, but also of resilience. Even when life offered little else, bread kept bodies working in the fields and children alive through winter. For the wealthy, bread told an entirely different story. Nobles and clergy consumed the finest white loaves, baked from carefully sifted wheat flour. This bread, known as manchet in later centuries, was soft, light, and expensive to produce. To be served white bread at a banquet was as much a symbol of status as wearing silk or owning a war horse. The colour itself was a marker of privilege, bright, pure, and far removed from the dark, heavy loaves of the village oven. Bread was also central to ritual. At meals, loaves were often used as trenchers, thick slices that doubled as plates, soaking up meat juices before being eaten, or given to the poor as charity. At Mass, bread transformed into the body of Christ, elevating the daily staple into a symbol of divine grace. Thus, from peasant huts to cathedral altars, bread linked survival with spirituality, sustenance with ceremony. Above all, bread carried weight as a political force. A failed harvest or inflated bread prices could spark riots. Lords and kings who failed to provide grain risked rebellion, for to deny bread was to deny life itself. In every crust and crumb lay a truth medieval people knew too well. Bread was not merely something you ate, it was the essence of life, power, and order in the medieval world. For medieval peasants, bread was both comfort and burden. It made up as much as 70 to 80% of their diet, eaten at nearly every meal, yet the quality of that bread was often far from appetizing. Poor households rarely had steady access to fine wheat flour. Instead, their loaves were made from rye, barley, oats, or a rough mixture of whatever grain the harvest had yielded. The result was bread that was dark, coarse, and heavy, more a block of sustenance than a delicate food. This peasant bread was sour from natural fermentation, baked dense and filling to stretch every grain as far as possible. Because the Lord controlled the mills, villagers were often required to grind their grain there, paying fees for the privilege. Afterward, they baked their loaves in communal ovens, sometimes paying in kind with a portion of the finished bread. The very act of eating, then, was bound up in systems of power and obligation. During lean years, when harvests failed or grain prices soared, peasants had little choice but to stretch their flour with substitutes. Beans, peas, chestnuts, or acorns might be ground in. In times of true desperation, even weeds, ground straw, or powdered bark were added. Such loaves were bitter, hard, and sometimes even dangerous, causing illness if improperly prepared. Yet to go without bread was worse, so these desperate mixtures became survival food in times of famine. Despite its humble quality, bread was versatile. A crust might be dipped in broth, eaten with cheese, or used to soak up vegetable stews. Leftover bread could be boiled into pottage, or dried and crumbled into other dishes. Even when stale, it still served a purpose. For the poor, nothing was wasted, not a crumb. There was also a symbolic element to bread among the poor. The act of breaking bread at the table, however meagre, carried with it a sense of family and community. Sharing a dark loaf in a peasant cottage bound people together as surely as fine wheat bread did at a noble feast. Bread was life, and even the simplest black loaf had dignity in its role. For the medieval poor, bread was both chain and lifeline. It represented their dependence on the land, their obligations to their lords, and the limits of their social status. Yet it was also the daily anchor of existence, a constant presence at the heart of survival. If the poor endured dark, heavy loaves, the wealthy enjoyed bread as a symbol of refinement and privilege. For nobles, clergy, and the merchant elite, the daily loaf was not simply about survival, but about status. The most prized bread was baked from fine, sifted wheat flour, free of husks and impurities. This bread was pale, soft, and delicate, so unlike the coarse black loaves of the village oven that it might as well have been an entirely different food. Known in later centuries as manchet, white bread was costly to produce. Milling wheat finely took time and skill, and the demand for purity meant discarding much of the grain that peasants would never waste. Only those with wealth could afford such extravagance, making the whiteness of bread itself a badge of class. A noble's table groaned with venison, poultry, and spiced sauces, but the gleaming white loaves were just as much a marker of privilege. To be served this bread was to be reminded of one's place in the social order. At banquets, bread was more than food, it was tableware. Large, thick slices of coarse but decent quality loaves were cut into trenchers, which doubled as edible plates. Meat, sauce, and gravy soaked into them during the meal. Afterward, trenchers might be eaten by the diners, or, more often, collected and distributed as alms to the poor waiting outside the castle gates. In this way, bread connected the excess of the nobility with the hunger of the peasantry. Bread also played a central role in ritual. At great feasts, loaves might be carved into decorative shapes, stamped with the Lord's seal, or presented in elaborate baskets to display wealth and generosity. In monasteries and cathedral chapters, fine bread was part of daily rations for higher clergy, while lower-ranking brothers ate darker loaves. Even within the church, the quality of one's bread reflected one's rank. To nobles, bread was comfort and symbol alike. It reassured them of their superiority and gave them a chance to display charity by passing leftovers to the needy. But the contrast was stark. While peasants chewed through gritty rye, nobles savoured soft white wheat loaves with honey or butter. In every bite lay a reminder of hierarchy. Bread may have been universal in the medieval world, but not all bread was equal. For the wealthy, it was proof that life could be savoured, while others merely endured it. If bread was the solid foundation of medieval life, ale was its liquid companion. Morning, noon, and night, it flowed across every social class, from peasant cottages to noble halls. But this was not the potent beer of modern pubs. It was small ale, a mild, low-alcohol brew consumed daily in place of water. In an age when rivers and wells were easily fouled by waste, ale was safer to drink, the brewing process killing off harmful bacteria. To medieval people, it was not indulgence, it was necessity. For peasants, small ale was often home brewed, made in simple cottages with whatever grains were available: barley, oats, or rye. The result was a cloudy, earthy drink, weak in strength but rich in calories, providing liquid sustenance for labourers working from dawn to dusk. Children drank it as readily as adults, and it was poured at every meal. A peasant's day might begin with bread and ale, continue with pottage and ale, and end with, you guessed it, more bread and ale. In towns and cities, ale houses became central to daily life. These establishments offered more than drink. They were meeting places, gossip hubs, and makeshift community halls. A penny bought a mug of small ale, affordable even to the working poor. But while ale kept bellies full and quenched thirst, it also provided brief respite from the grind of medieval life. Laughter, song, and camaraderie flowed as freely as the drink itself. The wealthy, too, consumed ale, though of finer quality. Nobles often had dedicated brew houses on their estates, producing stronger, clearer brews flavoured with herbs or even early hops. For them, ale was paired with roasted meats and rich feasts, not just bread and cheese. Yet even in a lord's hall, small ale was the standard drink of servants, squires, and guests alike. Brewing was typically women's work. Known as alewives, women managed the household brewing, selling surpluses to neighbours or markets. Their role in sustaining communities was vital, though often overlooked. Without them, daily life would grind to a halt, for without ale, thirst and disease would quickly follow. Ale was more than drink. It was cultural glue. It nourished bonded communities and offered comfort across the social spectrum. In every mug, from the rough-hewn wooden cups of peasants to the pewter tankards of knights, lay the same truth. Medieval life ran on bread and ale, the twin pillars of survival. To understand medieval ale, one must step into the smoky kitchens and backroom brewhouses where it was made. Brewing was not yet an industrial process, but a domestic craft, overseen primarily by women. Known as alewives, they brewed for their families first, and for neighbours or markets if there was surplus. In many villages, the skill of a good alewife was as valued as the skill of a good baker, for without her, thirst and sickness loomed. The process began with grain, barley if available, though oats, rye or wheat could be used. First, the grain was malted, soaked in water, allowed to sprout, then dried in a kiln. This released sugars that could later ferment. The malt was then ground and mixed with hot water to produce a thick porridge-like mash. From this, brewers drained the sweet liquid known as wort, which held the essence of the ale to be. Boiling came next. In large cauldrons, the wort was simmered with herbs for flavour and preservation. Before hops became widespread in later centuries, brewers relied on mixtures called gruit, blends of herbs like yarrow, bog myrtle, rosemary, and juniper. These gave medieval ale a sharp, sometimes medicinal taste, very different from the crisp bitterness we know today. Once boiled, the wort was cooled, then poured into open tubs where natural yeasts in the air sparked fermentation. The result, after a few days, was ale, ready to drink while still fresh and frothy. Unlike modern beer, medieval ale was not stored long. It soured quickly, often within days, so it was brewed frequently in small batches. A household might brew several times a week, ensuring a constant supply. Stronger ales could last longer, but the small ale that fueled daily life was meant to be consumed fast, before it spoiled. Brewing was not only domestic, but commercial. In towns, alewives sold their brews openly, sometimes marked by signs like a broom or greenery hung over the door. Authorities regulated prices and quality, for bad ale was not just unpleasant, it was a public hazard. A watered-down batch or spoiled brew could cause anger, fines, or even punishment. In the medieval world, brewing was both art and survival. It demanded skill, patience, and knowledge passed down through generations. Every cup of ale was the product of human ingenuity harnessing grain, fire, and fermentation. It was the drink that turned harvests into sustenance and kept medieval society running, one bubbling vat at a time. At every meal in the medieval world, whether in a peasant's hut or a noble's hall, two constants held sway: bread and ale. They were not simply side dishes or accompaniments, but the backbone of daily eating, the reliable staples that framed every bite and sip. For the poor, a meal often began and ended with bread. A crust of coarse rye or barley loaf was dipped into a bowl of pottage, a thick stew of beans, peas, onions, and whatever scraps of vegetables or meat were available. Ale washed it down, mild enough for children, hearty enough for men labouring from dawn to dusk. It was a diet heavy on sustenance and light on luxury, but it kept people alive and working. In many households, ale was brewed in such small batches that each day's jug was finished by nightfall, leaving nothing wasted. In contrast, noble tables offered bread in a variety of forms. Fine white wheat loaves were set before lords and ladies, while darker breads were reserved for servants and lesser guests. At great feasts, trenchers, thick slices of bread, were used as edible plates. These caught the juices of roasted meats and spiced sauces, soaking up flavour until they were eaten at the end of the meal, or collected and distributed to the poor as alms. The presence of multiple bread types at one table visually reinforced the hierarchy of the medieval world. Status was tasted as well as seen. Ale, too, was ever present. In castles, brewhouses produced stronger, clearer ale for the lord's table, sometimes flavoured with imported spices or herbs. Servants and soldiers drank small ale, the everyday brew that quenched thirst and nourished bodies. At feasts, great pitchers of ale flowed alongside wine, the latter reserved for the wealthiest or for special occasions. Even so, ale remained the true drink of daily life, trusted over water and cherished as part of every shared meal. Meals were rarely silent. Bread was broken, ale poured, and conversation flowed with it. Stories, gossip, and even political negotiations conducted over loaves and mugs. In monasteries, silence ruled the refectory, but even there bread and ale were constants, tying the lives of monks to those of the people beyond their cloisters. At every level of society, bread and ale transformed eating from a simple act of survival into a communal ritual. They were nourishment, but also symbols of labour, privilege, faith, and fellowship. To sit at a table without them would have felt unthinkable, almost unnatural in medieval daily life. Bread and ale were not only the staples of daily life, they also carried deep spiritual meaning in the medieval world. In a society where religion shaped every rhythm of existence, even the most ordinary loaf or jug of ale became symbols of faith, ritual, and divine provision. Bread, above all, held sacred significance. In the Christian liturgy, it was transformed during the Mass into the body of Christ, a miracle that elevated the humble loaf into the centerpiece of worship. Every medieval person, whether peasant or noble, knew that the bread they ate each day mirrored the bread consecrated at the altar. The words, "Give us this day our daily bread," were not metaphorical. They were as literal as they were spiritual. To go without bread in life was hunger. To go without the sacred bread was eternal peril. Ale, though not elevated to the same status, still had its place in religious life. Monasteries were famous for their brewing, providing not only sustenance for monks, but also hospitality for pilgrims and travellers. Within those cloisters, brewing was considered part of holy labour, turning grain into nourishment that supported both body and community. Monks brewed in staggering quantities, producing both small ale for daily consumption and stronger brews for feast days or guests of high rank. Their reputation for purity and quality made monastic ale some of the most trusted in Europe. Fasting practices also reflected the centrality of bread and ale. On days when meat and dairy were forbidden, bread became the primary staple, often eaten with vegetables or fish. Ale remained acceptable providing calories during long fasts that might otherwise have weakened the body. It blurred the line between food and drink, reinforcing its role as daily fuel blessed by God's providence. Even beyond church walls, bread and ale were woven into rituals of community and charity. At weddings, loaves and ale were shared to mark fertility and abundance. At funerals, bread and drink were distributed to mourners, binding the living together in grief and remembrance. Feasts in honour of saints often centred on the distribution of bread and ale to the poor, transforming everyday staples into instruments of mercy. In this way, bread and ale were more than nourishment. They were bridges between the earthly and the divine. Every bite of bread, every sip of ale reminded medieval people that their survival was both a gift of labour and a blessing from above, tying the physical act of eating to the eternal drama of faith. For all their centrality, bread and ale were never guaranteed. A poor harvest, a harsh winter, or war could transform daily staples into luxuries overnight. In medieval Europe, food shortages were frequent, and when the supply of grain faltered, life grew precarious. Bread, the essence of survival, suddenly became a measure of crisis. The first sign of scarcity was price. In villages and towns, the cost of grain climbed steeply when yields failed. Families who relied on buying flour or loaves soon found themselves priced out of the market. Anger at bakers and millers often followed, as people suspected hoarding or profiteering. Bread riots erupted in bad years, for to deny the people their loaves was to provoke desperation. Authorities sometimes stepped in with price controls, but enforcement was patchy at best. Hunger spread quickly when grain supplies thinned. When flour ran short, peasants turned to substitutes. Rye and barley replaced wheat, producing darker and denser loaves. In dire times, flour was stretched with beans, peas, or chestnuts, which added bulk but little taste. More desperate measures included acorns, ground straw, or even bark. These famine breads were heavy, bitter, and sometimes poisonous if improperly prepared. Accounts from the Middle Ages describe villagers gnawing on loaves so rough they cut the mouth, a cruel reminder that survival came at a price. Ale, too, was vulnerable in famine. Without barley or oats, brewing faltered. Families might water down their ale to make it last, or switch to rough herbal drinks. In some cases, desperate peasants brewed ale from whatever they could find, fermenting roots, fruits, or even weeds. The result was weak, sour, and often unsafe, but it was better than nothing. Alehouses suffered as much as households, their business collapsing when grain supplies failed. Scarcity also revealed hierarchy. While peasants starved on bark bread, nobles often still ate fine wheat loaves imported at great expense. Lords had the wealth to secure supplies, monasteries hoarded grain for their own communities, and the poor bore the brunt of famine. This inequality could fuel rebellion, as hungry villagers turned against the very lords who should have protected them. Famine left scars not only on bodies, but on memory. Generations remembered the bitter taste of substitute bread, the gnawing hunger, and the helplessness of watching stores run dry. Scarcity made clear the fragile balance of medieval life. When bread and ale vanished, so too did stability, reminding everyone that survival depended on the mercy of harvests. Bread and ale were more than food and drink. They were the foundation of medieval existence. From dawn until dusk, they sustained every class of society, shaping not just diets but economies, rituals, and even politics. Centuries later, their legacy still lingers, in our language, our traditions, and the very idea of what it means to share a meal. Bread was the ultimate symbol of life itself. Its centrality is reflected in medieval law and religion, where ensuring grain supplies was a duty of kings and lords. To control bread was to control society, for no one could live without it. Even today, phrases like breadwinner or our daily bread echo its role as the essential measure of sustenance. In the Middle Ages, a man might live on little more than coarse loaves, and a noble might dine on delicate wheat bread, but both understood that without bread, life unravelled. Ale, too, left a mark that endures. It was not the refined, hoppy beer of modern Europe, but a simpler, cloudier drink, more nourishment than indulgence. Its presence in every home, every monastery, and every tavern made it the social glue of the medieval world. Alehouses became centres of gossip, trade, and local politics, while monastic breweries laid the foundation for Europe's later beer culture. The reliance on ale over water reveals a truth about medieval life. Safety, health, and survival were bound up in the brewing kettle. Together, bread and ale shaped medieval identity. They were the common thread linking peasant cottages, noble feasts, and monastic cloisters. They marked the rhythms of life, from the trenches of banquets to the loaves broken as alms for the poor, from the morning jug of small ale to the sacred bread at Mass. They were not luxuries but constants, reminders of both human fragility and resilience. When famine struck, their absence tore at the fabric of society. When they were plentiful, they gave stability, even joy. The memory of their scarcity haunted generations, ensuring that grain stores and brewing vats were guarded as fiercely as castles. In the end, the legacy of bread and ale is not just about taste or sustenance. It is about survival, community, and culture. To break bread and share ale was to affirm life itself. In medieval Europe, no act was more universal, no habit more enduring than reaching for a loaf and raising a cup.